Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing really well. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, the heavens opened, and the staunchly unwavering rain pelted down without apology. The pertinacious gunmetal grey sky grew more threatening and foreboding with every passing minute. A flock of black ravens with open beaks squawked loudly as they flew past Mrs. Ashbluff's white Volkswagen truck in a long ribbon of gleaming black feathers towards the tall canopy of the trees, where lightly they would acquire shelter from these indomitable rain showers that looked unlikely to abate. Mrs. Ashbluff sighed with relief that she had both of her children safely in the back of her truck. They were as dry as toast, thank goodness. Thank goodness I picked you both up from school in the nick of time. It's sheeting down out there, isn't it? If I'd picked you up any later, you'd both be soaked to the skin. I dread to think. We might still get wet, Mum, her son Braden reminded her. We still have to make it back into the house when we get back without getting wet, and that's not going to be easy if the rain continues like this. It's a soaking rain. Well, we need to be grateful for rain, don't we? It's very good for the countryside. It turns everything green, so I'm not about to complain about the weather. But I will say this, it certainly knows how to pick its moments. Why does it always pelt down with rain when you're hanging out the washing or trying to sweep the path clear of leaves? It's never convenient. It always catches you off guard. Anyway, enough of that, sweethearts. I've got great news. I've got an umbrella in here, said Mrs. Ashbluff reassuringly. She glanced through her visor mirror at her daughter Kirsten, who was sitting on the back seat of the white truck, staring at the rain blankly, not saying a word. Mrs. Ashbluff was clandestinely very concerned for her daughter. She had noticed of late that Kirsten had lost her sparkle. She was a shadow of what she had been only 6 months before. It would seem her daughter had been so happy at her old school, but after they moved to the countryside, everything had changed quite dramatically, and regretfully not all for the good. Mr. and Mrs. Ashbluff had eagerly sold their old house in Denver, where they'd lived in the green leafy South Park neighborhood, close to the Denver Zoo and the Children's Hospital, where Mrs. Ashbluff had worked as a receptionist during the day, while her children attended the Cherry Creek High School in Denver. When her husband had discovered that he could do most of his work online, behind a computer, the couple had decided to move. Mrs. Ashbluff enjoyed her job as a receptionist, interacting with the doctors and staff at the Children's Hospital, but it had not been a difficult decision to swap their old life in Denver for a life in the Colorado countryside. They'd moved into a charming wooden ranch-style farmhouse. Indeed, it was a beautiful place to live, surrounded by transfixing picturesque mountain views, rolling hills, horse-riding trails, magnificent wood groves of trees, and viridescent meadows that sparkled cheerfully under the first flush of the morning sun. What was there not to like about living in this utterly exquisite part of the world? Moving here had been a no-brainer for the delighted couple, who both believed raising their kids in the natural world would only serve to enhance their quality of life. Yet Mrs. Ashbluff, whom had thought moving would be pretty straightforward and relatively uncomplicated, was to find she could not have been more wrong about that. Any form of natural adjustment was never easy, of course. Some aspects of their lives had slotted so perfectly into place, while others were dreadfully out of alignment, almost unhinged, so much so she couldn't get them to fit together, no matter how hard she tried. The major issue concerned the new school that Kirsten attended, that did not seem to be agreeing with her daughter. She had regretfully watched Kirsten retreat into her shell, like a tortoise becoming more and more detached and apathetic towards her life, as if she was caught up in a protective cocoon from which she did not want to escape. I'm really worried about Kirsten, she had told her husband Logan. I don't think she's settling down at her new school very well. She was so happy at her last school in Denver, but she's dreadfully out of sorts these days. She's not a happy bunny anymore, I'm afraid. That girl might as well be wearing barbs on her clothes, as she knows how to pierce you with her words if you probe into her life. I can't remember the last time I saw her laugh. The only time I see her smiling is when she's with the horses or taking Sunbeam for a ride. She loves her horse, but she hates that school she attends with a passion. I can see it in her eyes. A mother knows these things.
You worry too much, sweetheart,
her husband Logan had teased.
That's why I love you so very much. You put everybody else before yourself. You're selfless like that, but you need to relax. I'm sure it's only a matter of adjustment for Kirsten. It's not easy to start from scratch and make brand new friends. It's a work in progress, is it not? But she'll get there in the end. I have faith in our Kirsten. Even for me, working in this new environment has taken a while to get used to. But I wouldn't change it for the world. I love it out here, and I'm very glad we moved from Denver.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, said Tessa Ashcroft. I mean, look at our Braden. Our son is positively blossoming. He's made a plethora of new friends. But I just don't get the impression that Kirsten has made any friends at all at that new school of hers. And that irks and unsettles me greatly. It can be very soul-destroying having no friends, you know.
All in good time, sweetheart, Logan had said to his wife lovingly. What do they say? Rome was not built in a day. You mark my words, in a year's time, Kirsten will be very happy at her new school. It probably takes longer for her to adapt, that's all. We're not made of the same stuff. Some of us take time to resettle. I think you could put our Braden in a forest with a tent. He would have harmonized to his territory within hours, let alone days. Braden is like a chameleon. He naturally just adapts. Let's face it, even when Caitlin first entered the world, don't you remember? It was a struggle to get her to be born. Even the midwife said as much. She didn't want to leave the safety of your womb. But let's just say Braden couldn't get out fast enough. You delivered him in our truck on the way to the hospital, before even the EMTs got to you. Don't you remember? Never been so scared in all my life. That boy of ours wanted to be born, but Kirsten, she's always been reluctantly wary about most things, much more guarded and withdrawn. That's who she is. But there's nothing to worry about there.
Mrs. Ashbluff glances at her daughter once again, through the visor mirror. The rain continues to bucket down. The asphalt road glistens from the gleaming water that shines on its surface, while the surrounding countryside twinkles and sparkles under the raindrops as the dust is washed away, and leaves from the trees begin to brighten. They can hear the ominous booms of thunder drum-rolling in the distance, but luckily Mrs. Ashbluff has not caught any lightning flashes trespassing across the sky. She's quite sure the storm will soon pass. Kirsten, tell me, how was your day at school, sweetheart? She can see her daughter's lips turn down into an upside-down smile or scowl, another dreadful habit that she developed soon after they moved here. Her daughter used to always smile, but the last time Kirsten was really happy was at her goodbye party in Denver, when everyone was bidding her farewell and wishing her good luck for her new life. Everyone was desperately sad to see Kirsten go. She had been very popular at the old school and had acquired tons of friends there. But since they had moved here, Kirsten did not appear to have made any friends. She hadn't made any progress in that regard, and that was very upsetting to Mrs. Ashbluff, who was desirous for both of her children to be very happy here. Why do you always ask me about school, Mum? How was your day? How was this? How was that? I told you everything you need to know. I hate it here. I want to go back to Denver to my old school. I loved it there. I had good friends. You know you can't, sweetheart. That's not an option for you anymore. Surely you must have made some friends here, darling. It can't be all that bad. There must be some lovely girls in your class at school. Perhaps if you tried to interact with them, things would be different for you. I mean, you're naturally shy by nature. You listen to yourself, Mum. You prattle on and on and on, telling me what I should do and what I shouldn't do. You don't understand how it works. So quit asking your nauseating, insufferable questions. You don't know what it's like living in our generation. You're clueless. You lived in a day and age when your phones were connected to the house. You didn't have social media or Instagram. You come from a completely different world to ours. You make me sound as if I'm so long in the tooth and obsolete.
I do have my uses, you know, sweetheart. I'm not a dinosaur. Why don't you explain it to me, darling? I'd like to understand. Maybe I could help. Help, Mum? You know what? If you really want to help me, Mum, keep your nosy, interfering bat out of my business, will you? Mrs. Ashbluff ignores her daughter's thorny, barbed reactions. She's well used to them by now. And although her daughter can be bristly and brusque, she knows she is hurting, and as a mother it breaks her heart not to know how to help her daughter. She puts on the radio as a means of distraction, to iron out the tension that like a bad smell has wafted over her truck. Her children remain quietly silent, barring the unwelcome distraction from the rude music that is blaring through the radio, caught amidst some obstructive static reception. It's amazing how the mountains can intractably interfere with the radio and cell phone signals, especially in bad weather like this. They drive through the countryside back to the farmhouse. It's always so pleasant, as Mrs. Ashbluff never fails to be enchanted by the scenery. Her hard-working husband is probably bustling around in his study, working online, making big deals from behind his computer, in a tiny, rather uninspiring office. Sometimes Logan is so diligently hard-working that he works through lunch, and she only ever sees him in the late afternoon, when he takes a much-needed exercise break, by riding his American quarter horse in the countryside. It seems her husband has bonded with that horse Fairfield, but so has Kirsten, who couldn't ride when they first moved here, but now she's a natural on horseback, and is very attached to the two horses they have. When Kirsten gets back from school, she would usually head straight to the meadow, with reins in her hands to saddle up Fairfield, and take him for a ride. The horse was a likeable character, benevolent, friendly, very warm-hearted. Mrs. Ashbluff is so pleased about this, as she knows that when her daughter rides Fairfield, it's an excellent way for her to let off some of her steam. But these days she's also riding her beloved Sunbeam, a black and bay American quarter horse, whom she's broken in very successfully when she gained the horse's trust. Sunbeam was recently rescued from a nearby farm, where she was so emaciated and was going to be put down as she'd been cruelly abused by the former owner. It would seem Kirsten had seen a photograph of the half-starved horse in the local paper and had insisted in rescuing the creature. She had wept and wept about the horse until her parents had relented and taken their daughter to visit the creature. The shelter was going to put down Sunbeam, but Kirsten begged them to let her adopt the horse. "I promise I'll make him better," she told the shelter. "It's too far gone, sweetheart," she had been told. "But if you really want to take care of the horse and take him off our hands, good luck to you." By some miraculous twist of fate, and against all the tumultuous odds stacked against Sunbeam, the tenacious horse had miraculously fully recovered, thanks to the devoted diligence of Kirsten's care. It was hard to believe a horse that looked like a walking corpse stood a chance of getting well again, but Kirsten had not given up on him, and her determination to make that horse better was all-consuming. There had been times she'd slept in the stable overnight with the horse, nursing him through the night, refusing to leave his side. She had talked to him and told him that he could pull through anything, that she had faith in him. It would seem prodigiously that the American quarter horse Sunbeam had regained all the weight he'd lost. But not only that, the family were immensely surprised to see what a spectacular specimen Sunbeam was. His coat gleamed, his temperament was kind. The horse did not trust men, as it had been abused by a man, so there was no way that Kirsten's father could ride Sunbeam, but he was devoted to Kirsten. The presence of Sunbeam was the only positive thing that had happened in Kirsten's life since the family had moved to the farmhouse, as both the horses made her very happy. It was a dreadful pity that Kirsten seemed unable to listen to her own sagacious, judicious advice that she had so willingly given Sunbeam when he was hanging on to the threads of his own life, on unsteady, rather wobbly legs that were almost failing to support his withering form. Let's just say that no one felt her daughter's lugubrious desolation more than Tessa Ashbluff herself. When any of her children were hurting, so was she. She was growing increasingly concerned about her daughter's well-being, and was hesitantly reluctant to discuss the matter any further with her husband. She felt Logan, although well-meaning, was dismissive to her grievous concerns, brushing them away indifferently, as if he thought she was overreacting and being far too melodramatic. He was not taking their daughter's emotional state of mind seriously enough.
and Tessa Ashcroft could not shake off the unsettling feeling that something was terribly wrong with her daughter, and this sense of foreboding ate into her heart like a worm devouring its way through an apple. It was almost as if a church bell of warning was ringing through her bloodstream, telling her to pay attention. Logan had always been an easygoing character, who always saw the good in everything. He failed to see that not every cloud had a silver lining. "Here we are, home at last! Isn't that wonderful?" says Mrs. Ashbluff, as her Volkswagen rolls eagerly down the long gravel dirt driveway towards the farmhouse. There was no doubt that this farmhouse was as pretty as a picture, happily nestled in the valley, surrounded by the distant sculptural backdrop of the mountains that stood erect and proud against the bleak pewter colour of the clouds, which made everything look dramatic as the rain continued to splatter down. "We're going to have to make a dash to the farmhouse with my umbrella," says Mrs. Ashbluff. "I'll take you to the house first, Kirsten, and then I'll come back for you, Braden. How about that? This way we'll avoid being saturated by rain." "Don't you worry about me, Mum," said Braden. "I don't mind getting wet. I'm not a sissy. A little rain never hurt anyone." When they managed to get into the house, Kirsten dropped all her things on the kitchen table and bolted towards the kitchen door. She was clearly going outside. "Where are you going?" asked her mother. "You don't want to go out there. You'll get soaked to the skin." "I'm taking the horses to the stable block," said Kirsten. "Look at them. They're getting drenched in the rain. I'm sure Sunbeam is getting scared with the booming thunder in the distance. They both look so miserable out there, getting wet. I need to bring them into the dry." "You'll get wet yourself," said her mother. "Do I look like I care?" says Kirsten. "I have a duty of responsibility to both of those horses, and that's what I care about." Mrs. Ashbluff watched her daughter, dashing out in the pouring rain, running towards the horses in the meadow, who were trying to shelter under a large oak tree. They looked relieved to see Kirsten, and to be guided safely to the confines of their warm and dry stable block, away from the pounding, unrelenting rain. Mrs. Ashbluff could see her daughter was getting soaked to the skin, but she didn't appear to care. She was fastidiously attending to her horses' every need, no doubt laying down hay and food for them. She knew her daughter adored those horses, and admired her sacrificial spirit. Mrs. Ashbluff saw her daughter's cell phone lying on the kitchen counter. She reached out for it, knowing what she was doing was terribly wrong. She wanted to glance through the messages to see what was going on in her enigmatic daughter's mind. Maybe scanning through her cell phone at this opportune moment, while her daughter was not around, might give her a glimmer of what was actually going on in her life. Her son Braden was drying himself off in the kitchen with a towel. He looked up at her in abject horror, as if his mother was committing a mortal sin. "Mum, what are you doing looking at Kirsten's cell phone? You can't look through her messages. That's prying. I'd kill you if you were looking through my private stuff like that." "I don't want you to tell Kirsten what I'm doing, Braden. It's very important you don't. Sometimes a mother's got to do what a mother's got to do. One day you'll understand, when you have kids of your own. If you must know, I'm not snooping. Well, not really. I'm very worried about your sister. The only thing she cares about at the moment are those horses. She'll do anything for them. Your sister's in a bad place, Braden. I know she is. I'm sure you can see that. Ever since we moved here, she hasn't been herself. Have you noticed how sad she's been of late? It's a botheration for me. I need to make sense of what's actually going on in her life. I hasten to say, Braden, I'd do exactly the same for you if you looked so miserable. I'm glad to say you've settled down to life here triumphantly. But your sister, she's another matter. She's a conundrum. I can't figure her out at all. I need to know what's going on in that little head of hers in order to help her conquer the stumbling blocks that she's facing at the moment. She's not happy, Mum, because she's got no friends at school. That's why she's upset. No one likes her at her new school. She told you that? Yeah, she told me nobody wants to be her friend, and everybody's horrible, especially the girls. But why? I don't understand. She was so popular at her old school. She told me that she eats her lunch at the school canteen all on her own, and the kids whisper and gossip about her behind her back. If she goes and sits near one of them, they pick up their tray and just walk away from her. That's terrible. But why, Braden? Asked Mrs. Ashbluff. Help me to understand why. I mean, she was so popular at her old school, wasn't she? I mean, why would kids choose to be so deliberately mean to her here? It doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. I don't know, Mum. I know she hates that school. The kids are vile to her, making fun of her behind her back. But then it's her fault. She never stands up for herself, does she? That's her problem. When I started at my school and I saw some kids talking about me on my first day, do you know I went straight up to them and said, "What are you saying about me? Because if it's not nice, I'll punch your lights out." And they shut up. I'm sorry to say this, Mum, but Kirsten has always been a wet blanket. She's her own worst enemy. People take advantage of you when you've got no backbone. That's not good, said Mrs. Ashbluff, opening her daughter's cell phone, surprised to see that it wasn't locked. Her daughter had sent a text to her best friend in Denver, Lisa Rose. This was interesting. She scrolled down to the message. "Hello, Lisa. Missing you tons. Still no friends. It's a bummer. I hate this school. Everyone is so unfriendly here. They're always whispering and smirking behind my back." "That's awful. Why don't you ask your mum if you can board at our house? My mum wouldn't mind," came Lisa's reply. "You're right," says Mrs. Ashbluff, sighing. "It's official. Your sister hates her school and is struggling to make friends. My heart bleeds for her. What can I do about it?" "There's nothing you can do to help her, Mum. If you interfere, you'll only make her as mad as hell. The only person that can help her is herself. It's her problem, not yours. She's a bit of a closed book, Mum. When she meets new people, she can be very reserved. So that's not exactly going to endear her to the kids at the school. She needs to make a bit of an effort, grow a pair of you-know-what." 2 weeks later, the weekend had arrived, and Mrs. Ashbluff was alone at home with her daughter Kirsten. Her son was away staying with one of his newly acquired friends on their hunting ranch, while her husband Logan was spending a few days abroad on business. He was on a trip to Norway. It was just Mrs. Ashbluff and her daughter alone together under one roof. The quintessential opportunity for Mrs. Ashbluff to spend quality time with her daughter and maybe have a good old chinwag. She wanted to make this evening particularly special, and so had prepared her daughter's favourite dish, Chinese-style sweet and sour chicken and rice. She had followed the recipe from a Chinese chef online and had made it once before very successfully, and Kirsten had told her it tasted better than takeout. Mrs. Ashbluff had promptly decided that the following morning she was going to go out of a limb for her daughter and spoil her rotten, hopefully lifting her out of her dispirited melancholia. She had to do something, as her daughter's spiralling downcast mood over the last day or so had become dolefully stormy. She was snapping at everyone like a turtle and looked incredibly downtrodden, as if she was overwhelmed about the issues of life. And the sinking, disquieted feeling Mrs. Ashbluff had about her daughter's psychological state was growing increasingly more alarmed. She would take her daughter out shopping to look for some pretty summer clothes at the very avant-garde boutique in town that everybody was raving about. Maybe they'd enjoy a relaxing Thai massage together, along with a spot of lunch at a notable Italian restaurant that she knew made the most delicious authentic Italian pizzas. It was wonderful to have some lone time with her daughter. She had decided they'd watch a movie together this evening after dinner. Mrs. Ashbluff called out to her daughter, whose bedroom was further down the passage. "Kirsten! Kirsten!" she called again. "Dinner is served! Come on, hurry up, it's getting cold!" "Kirsten!" she called again and again, but once again there was no response. Normally at the first sign of dinner being served, especially a dinner like this, which consisted of Kirsten's absolute favourite food, she'd be out of her bedroom like a hungry bullet. She was always ravenous, but not this evening. This behaviour was incongruous, erroneous, and paradoxical for her daughter. In a trice, Mrs. Ashbluff, her prognostic instincts, knew something was terribly wrong. Her stomach shuddered, churned and jolted, as if she'd been shocked with 100 volts of electricity. "No! No!" she cried out. "Please, God, no!" As a harbinger of doom descended on her gut instincts like a vulture out of the sky. And macabre visions where she could see her daughter harming herself came flooding into her mind without restraint. Mrs. Ashbluff senses what she could only describe as a foreshadowing of dread trickling down her spine that nudged her so sharply, like a knife piercing through the guts. Something was terribly wrong. There was no doubt about that. Mrs. Ashcroft speedily dashed towards her daughter's bedroom, but it was empty. There were puddles of clothes scattered across the floor haphazardly, and an unmade bed covered with schoolbooks, with pages that had been torn to shreds, was lying not only over the duvet cover, but across the floor. Her daughter appeared to have scribbled in red crayon over her school textbooks with the words, "Go and suck eggs." Mrs. Ashcroft ran to the bathroom. It was locked. A steam rose up in a mist of vaporous clouds from under the door. She banged at the door as hard as she could. "Kirsten! Kirsten, are you in there? Kirsten, are you in there? Please let me in. Please let me in. Is everything all right in there?" Once again, there was no response. She could hear the dreadful trickling of water dropping out of a warm tap as it hit the water in the bath, one drop at a time. But there was no other sound. Beyond that, the silence was deafening, the sound of the dripping tap distressingly inauspicious. A pandemonium of sheer panic began to bolt through Mrs. Ashbluff's mind, which became an indeterminable whirl, with ambiguous thoughts she could not grasp, like 1,000 clothes spinning around a washing machine that she couldn't reach. Her heart was pounding in her chest violently, and she found her breathing had become rapid. The very sturdy door was locked from the inside. Mrs. Ashbluff needed to get into that bathroom now, before it was too late. But how was she going to do this? The door was exceedingly well made, tough, unyielding, and sturdy, not easy to break down at all. She feared the worst for her daughter. A dreadful foreboding wrote on the tablet of her heart what she expected she'd find on the other side. A sinking feeling of impending dread seemed to swallow her up alive. She tried to kick the bathroom door open, but it was no use. She wasn't strong enough. The door didn't budge, no matter how hard she kicked it. Worse still, they didn't have a spare key for that bathroom door. Everything that unfolded seemed so surreal to Mrs. Ashbluff, as if it was all happening to somebody else, but not to her. This was insane, she thought. This happens in the movies, not in real life. Not to me. Not to my daughter. Mrs. Ashbluff ran to the outside shed to retrieve an axe. She banged as hard as she could at the door, with an audacious determination that could not be subdued. Soon she'd made a large enough hole in the bathroom door to reach her hand through the jagged opening, to turn the key in the lock. Finally she succeeded in her mission, from sheer determination and brute force. She was greeted to a sight that no parent should ever see. Her daughter was lying in a bath of crimson-coloured water, fully clothed to spare her modesty, and there was an empty bottle of pills lying on the floor beside her. Mrs. Ashbluff ran towards her daughter. Her lamenting heart was booming, her mind screaming, "No, please, no, God, no, please! Wake up, Kirsten! Wake up! For goodness sake, wake up, Kirsten! You've got to wake up!" She began to shake her daughter vigorously. "Wake up, Kirsten! Wake up, please!" Her daughter barely responded. Her eyes were rolling in the back of her head, but Mrs. Ashbluff could detect a faint pulse. She sighed with relief. Her daughter wasn't dead yet, which meant there was a faint glimmer of hope. She pulled out the cell phone from the pocket of her jeans and called 911. "911, what's your emergency?" came the response. "It's my daughter. Please come at once. Please. She tried to kill herself. She's cut her wrists. I think she's taken some pills. There's blood everywhere. I don't know what to do. I've detected a faint pulse. She's still alive. She's in a bad way. She's unresponsive." "The emergency services are on their way. Can you try and thwart the bleeding from the wrists?" came the kind, authoritative voice. "But stay on the line with me, madam. Stay very calm. If you panic, you make things far worse for yourself and for your daughter. See if you can find some bandages or strips of sheet. Tie them around the wrists to stop the bleeding. It's very important to stop the bleeding." Everything began to spin out of control in Mrs. Ashbluff's head. Her thoughts a jumbled blur, a tangled chaos. And every second that went by, waiting for that ambulance to arrive, seemed to last a lifetime. Seconds felt like hours. Minutes felt like days, even weeks. Time seemed to move forward at a snail's pace. The only way that Mrs. Ashbluff could describe the turmoil she was feeling was like being thrown into a jar of jelly beans and being shaken around so violently, vigorously. Once the EMTs arrived, she could tell by the efficient way they were working on her daughter that time was of the essence. Soon she sat in the ambulance, holding her daughter's hands,
as she was ferried to the hospital. For a second her daughter's eyes opened very briefly. "I'm sorry, Mum," her daughter managed to say. "I'm really sorry. It was the photograph. I had to do it. There was no other way." "Photograph?" said her mother. "What are you talking about, Kirsten?" But Kirsten did not respond. She had slipped back into oblivion. But Mrs. Ashbluff knew a photograph had resulted in her daughter's attempting to take her own life. She could not get her mind around this. She needed to find out exactly what was going on. She was tired of all her daughter's secrecy. If she had been more on the ball, she might have been able to have averted this disaster from ever happening. So this is the end of part 1. Part 2 is tomorrow night. Until next time, goodbye and good night.